The Munich air disaster occurred on 6 February 1958 when British European Airways Flight 609 crashed on its third attempt to take off from a slush-covered runway at Munich-Riem Airport, West Germany. On the plane was the Manchester United football team, nicknamed the Busby Babes, along with supporters and journalists. 20 of the 44 on the aircraft died at the scene. The injured, some unconscious, were taken to the Rechts der Isar Hospital in Munich where 3 more died, resulting in 23 fatalities with 21 survivors. The football team was returning from a European Cup match in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, against Red Star Belgrade. The flight stopped to refuel in Munich because a non-stop flight from Belgrade to Manchester was out of the Elizabethan-class Airspeed Ambassador aircraft's range. After refueling, pilots James Thane and Kenneth Raymond twice abandoned takeoff because of boost surging in the left engine. Fearing they would get too far behind schedule, Captain Thane rejected an overnight stay in Munich in favor of a third takeoff attempt. By then, snow was falling, causing a layer of slush to form at the end of the runway. After the aircraft hit the slush, it plowed through a fence beyond the end of the runway and the left wing was torn off after hitting a house. Fearing the aircraft might explode, Thane began evacuating passengers while Manchester United goalkeeper Harry Gregg helped pull survivors from the wreckage. An investigation by West German airport authorities originally blamed Thane, saying he did not ice the aircraft's wings. Despite eyewitness statements to the contrary, it was later established that the crash was caused by the slush on the runway, which slowed the plane too much to take off. Thane was cleared in 1968, 10 years after the incident. Manchester United were trying to become the third club to win 3 successive English league titles. They were 6 points behind league leaders, Wolverhampton Wanderers, with 14 games to go. They also held the Charity Shield and had just advanced into the second successive European Cup semi-final. The team had not been beaten for 11 matches. The crash not only derailed their title ambitions that year but also virtually destroyed the nucleus of what promised to be one of the greatest generations of players in English football history. It would take 10 years for the club to recover, with Busby rebuilding the team and winning the European Cup in 1968 with a new generation of babes. Background: in April 1955, UEFA established the European Cup, a football competition for the champion clubs of UEFA-affiliated nations, to begin in the 1955-56 season. However, the English League winners, Chelsea, were denied entry by the Football League's secretary, Alan Hardacre, who believed not playing was best for English football. The following season, the English League was won by Manchester United, managed by Matt Busby. The Football League again denied entry, but Busby and his chairman, Harold Hardman, with the help of the Football Association's chairman Stanley Rouse, defied the league and United became the first English team to play in Europe. The team, known as the Busby Babes for their youth, reached the semi-finals, beaten by the eventual winners, Real Madrid. Winning the first division title again that season meant qualification for the 1957-58 tournament, and their cup run in 1956-57 meant they were one of the favourites to win. Domestic league matches were on Saturdays and European matches midweek, so, although air travel was risky, it was the only choice if United were to fulfill their league fixtures, which they would have to do if they were to avoid proving Alan Hardacre right. After overcoming Shamrock Rovers and Dukla Prague in the preliminary and first round respectively, United were drawn with Red Star Belgrade of Yugoslavia for the quarter-finals, after beating them 2-1 at Old Trafford on 14 January 1958. The club was to travel to Yugoslavia for the return leg on 5 February. On the way back from Prague in the previous round, fog over England prevented the team from flying back to Manchester, so they flew to Amsterdam before taking the ferry from the Hook of Holland to Harwich and then the train to Manchester. The trip took its toll on the players and they drew 3-3 with Birmingham City at St Andrews 3 days later. Eager not to miss Football League fixtures and not to have a difficult trip again, the club chartered a British European Airways plane from Manchester to Belgrade for the away leg against Red Star. The match was drawn 3-3, but it was enough to send United to the semi-finals. The takeoff from Belgrade was delayed for an hour after outside right Johnny Berry lost his passport, and the plane landed in Munich for refueling at 13:15 GMT. Aircraft and crew. The aircraft was a 6-year-old Airspeed Ambassador II, built in 1952 and delivered to be the same year. The pilot, Captain James Thane, was a former RAF flight lieutenant. Originally a sergeant, he was given an emergency commission in the RAF as an acting pilot officer on probation in April 1944, and promoted to pilot officer on probation in September that year. He was promoted to flight lieutenant in May 1948, and received a permanent commission in the same rank in 1952. He retired from the RAF to join B. The co-pilot, Captain Kenneth Raymond, was also a former RAF flight lieutenant and a Second World War flying ace. After joining the RAF in 1940, he was promoted to sergeant in September 1941. He was commissioned as a War Substantive Pilot Officer a year later, and promoted to War Substantive Flying Officer in May 1943. He shot down 5 German fighters, 1 Italian plane and a V-1 flying bomb. He was awarded the DFC in July 1943, and promoted to flight lieutenant in September 1943. After leaving the RAF in 1945, he joined BOAC in Cairo, before joining B in 1947. He had had experience with Vikings, Dakotas and the Ambassador Elizabethan-class crash. Thane had flown the Elizabethan-class Airspeed Ambassador to Belgrade but handed the controls to Raymond for the return. At 14:19 GMT, the control tower at Munich was told the plane was ready to take off and gave clearance for takeoff, expiring at 14:31. Raymond abandoned the takeoff after Thane noticed the port boost pressure gauge fluctuating as the plane reached full power and the engine sounded odd while accelerating. A second attempt was made 3 minutes later, but called off 40 seconds into the attempt because the engines were running on an over-rich mixture, causing them to over-accelerate, a common problem for the Elizabethan. After the second failure, passengers retreated to the airport lounge. By then, it had started to snow heavily, and it looked unlikely that the plane would be making the return journey the day. Manchester United's Duncan Edwards sent a telegram to his landlady in Manchester. It read, "All flights cancelled, flying tomorrow. Duncan." Thane told the station engineer, Bill Black, about the problem with the boost surging in the port engine, and Black suggested that since opening the throttle more slowly had not worked, the only option was to hold the plane overnight for retuning. Thane was anxious to stay on schedule and suggested opening the throttle even more slowly would suffice. This would mean that the plane would not achieve takeoff velocity until further down the runway, but with the runway almost 2 kilometers long, he believed this would not be a problem. The passengers were called back to the plane 15 minutes after leaving it. A few of the players were not confident flyers, particularly Liam Whelan, who said, "This may be death, but I'm ready." Others, including Duncan Edwards, Tommy Taylor, Mark Jones, Eddie Coleman and Frank Swift, moved to the back of the plane, believing it safer. Once everyone was on board, Thane and Raymond got the plane moving again at 14:56. At 14:59, they reached the runway holding point, where they received clearance to line up ready for takeoff. On the runway, they made final cockpit checks, and at 15:02, they were told that takeoff clearance would expire at 15:04. The pilots agreed to attempt takeoff, but that they would watch the instruments for surging in the engines. At 15:03, they told the control tower of the decision. Raymond moved the throttle forward slowly and released the brakes. The plane began to accelerate, and radio officer Bill Rogers radioed the control tower with the message "Zulu uniform rolling." The plane threw up slush as it gathered speed, and Thane called out the plane's velocity in 10-knot increments. At 85 knots, the port engine began to surge again, and he pulled back marginally on the port throttle before pushing it forward again. Once the plane reached 117 knots, he announced V1, at which it was no longer safe to abort takeoff, and Raymond listened for the call of V2, the minimum required to get off the ground. Thane expected the speed to rise, but it fluctuated around 117 knots before suddenly dropping to 112 knots, and then 105 knots. Raymond shouted, "Christ, we won't make it." As Thane looked up to see what lay ahead, the plane skidded off the end of the runway, crashed into the fence surrounding the airport and across the road before its port wing was torn off as it caught a house, home to a family of 6. The father and eldest daughter were away, and the mother and the other 3 children escaped as the house caught fire. Part of the plane's tail was torn off before the left side of the cockpit hit a tree. The right side of the fuselage hit a wooden hut, inside which was a truck filled with tires and fuel, which exploded. 20 passengers died on board, and 3 died later in hospital. On seeing flames around the cockpit, Thane feared that the aircraft would explode and told his crew to evacuate the area. The stewardesses, Rosemary Cheverton and Margaret Bellis, were the first to leave through a blown-out emergency window in the galley, followed by radio officer Bill Rogers. Raymond was trapped in his seat by the crumpled fuselage and told Thane to go without him. Thane clambered out of the galley window. On reaching the ground, he saw flames growing under the starboard wing, which held 500 imperial gallons of fuel. He shouted to his crew to get away and climbed back into the aircraft to retrieve 2 handheld fire extinguishers, stopping to tell Raymond he would be back when the fires had been dealt with. Meanwhile, in the cabin, goalkeeper Harry Gregg was regaining consciousness, thinking that he was dead. He felt blood on his face and didn't dare put hand up. Thought the top of head had been taken off, like a hard-boiled egg. Just above him, light shone into the cabin, so Gregg kicked the hole wide enough for him to escape. He also managed to save some passengers. Fatalities: crew members Captain Kenneth "Ken" Raymond, co-pilot, survived but suffered multiple injuries and died in hospital 3 weeks later as a result of brain damage. Tom Cable, cabin steward. Passengers Manchester United players Jeff Bent, Roger Byrne, Eddie Coleman, Duncan Edwards, Mark Jones, David Pegg, Tommy Taylor, Liam Billy Whelan. Manchester United staff Walter Crickmer, club secretary, Tom Curry, trainer, Bert Wally, chief coach. Journalists: Alf Clark, Manchester Evening Chronicle, Donny Davies, Manchester Guardian, George Follows, Daily Herald, Tom Jackson, Manchester Evening News, Archie Ledbrick, Daily Mirror, Henry Rose, Daily Express. Frank Swift, News of the World. Eric Thompson, Daily Mail. Other passengers: Bellamy Close, travel agent. Willie Suttonoff, supporter, racecourse owner and close friend of Matt Busby. Survivors crew: Margaret Bellis, stewardess. Rosemary Cheverton, stewardess. George William Bill Rogers, radio officer. Captain James Thane, pilot. Passengers: Manchester United players Johnny Berry, Jackie Blanche Flower, Bobby Charlton, Bill Folkes, Harry Gregg, Kenny Morgans, Albert Scanlon, Dennis Viollet, Ray Wood. Manchester United staff: Matt Busby, manager. Journalists and photographers: Ted Elliard, Daily Mail telegraphist. Peter Howard, Daily Mail photographer. Frank Taylor, News Chronicle reporter. Other passengers: Vera Lukic, the wife of a Yugoslavian diplomat, and her baby daughter, Vesna. Both passengers were saved by Harry Gregg. At the time, Vera Lukic was pregnant with her son Zoran. Elena Miklos, wife of Bela Miklos. Neboj Sabato Tomasevic, Yugoslavian diplomat. Investigation. Although the crash was originally blamed on pilot error, it was subsequently found to have been caused by slush towards the end of the runway, causing deceleration of the aircraft and preventing safe flying speed. During takeoff, the aircraft had reached 117 knots, but, on entering the slush, dropped to 105 knots, too slow to level the ground. With not enough runway to abort the takeoff, aircraft with tailwheel undercarriages had not been greatly affected by slush, due to the geometry of these undercarriages in relation to the aircraft's center of gravity. But newer types, such as the Ambassador, with nose wheel landing gear and the main wheels behind the center of gravity, were found to be vulnerable. The accident resulted in the imposition of operating limits for the amount of slush build-up permitted on runways. Despite this conclusion, the German airport authorities took legal action against Captain Thane, as the one pilot who had survived the crash. They claimed he had taken off without clearing the wings of ice, which caused the crash, despite several witnesses stating that no ice had been seen. De-icing the aircraft was the captain's responsibility, while the state of the airport's runways was the responsibility of the airport authorities, among whom there was widespread ignorance of the danger of slush on runways for aircraft such as the Ambassador. The basis of the German authorities' case relied on the icy condition of the wings hours after the crash and a photograph of the aircraft taken shortly before takeoff that appeared to show snow on the upper wing surfaces. When the original negative was examined, however, no snow or ice could be seen, the snow in the original having been due to the sun reflecting off the wings, which was clarified when examining the negative rather than the published pictures which had been produced from a copy negative. The witnesses were not called to the German inquiry, and proceedings against Thane dragged on until 1968, when he was finally cleared of any responsibility for the crash. As the official cause, British authorities recorded a build-up of melting snow on the runway which prevented the Elizabethan from reaching the required takeoff speed. Thane, having been dismissed by B shortly after the accident and never engaged, retired and returned to run his poultry farm in Berkshire. He died of a heart attack at the age of 53 in August 1975. Aftermath: 7 of Manchester United's players died immediately, and Duncan Edwards died from his injuries on the 21st of February at the Rechts der Isar Hospital in Munich. Johnny Berry and Jackie Blanche Flower were both injured so severely that they never played again. Matt Busby was seriously injured and had to stay in hospital for more than 2 months after the crash, and was read his last rites twice. After being discharged from hospital, he went to Switzerland to recuperate in Interlaken. At times, he felt like giving up football entirely, until he was told by his wife Jean, "You know, Matt, the lads would have wanted you to carry on." Quote, That statement lifted Busby from his depression, and he returned by land to Manchester, before watching his team play in the 1958 FA Cup final. Meanwhile, there was speculation that the club would fold, but a threadbare United team completed the 1957-58 season, with Busby's assistant Jimmy Murphy standing in as manager. He had not travelled to Belgrade as he was in Cardiff managing the Welsh national team. At the time, a team largely made up of reserve and youth team players beat Sheffield Wednesday 3-0 in the first match after the disaster. The programme for that match showed simply a blank space where each United player's name should have been. Following the loss of so many players in the crash, United were desperate to find replacements with experience. So Murphy turned to players like Ernie Taylor and Stan Crowther, the Aston Villa wing-half who had played against United in the 1957 FA Cup final. Three players, Derek Lewin, Bob Hardesty and Warren Bradley, were loaned to United by non-league club Bishop Auckland. There were changes in the backroom staff at the club too, following the deaths of secretary Walter Crickmore and coaches Tom Curry and Bert Wally. United goalkeeper Les Olive, still registered as a player at the time of the disaster, retired from playing and took over from Crickmore as club secretary, while another former United goalkeeper, Jack Crompton, took over coaching duties after United chairman Harold Hardman had negotiated with Crompton's then employers Luton Town for his release. United only won one league game after the crash, causing the title challenge to collapse, and they fell to 9th place in the league. They did manage to reach the final of the FA Cup, however, losing 2-0 to Bolton Wanderers, and even managed to beat Milan at Old Trafford in the semi-finals of the European Cup, only to lose 4-0 at the San Siro. Real Madrid, who went on to win the trophy for the third year running, suggested that Manchester United be awarded the trophy for that year, a suggestion supported by Red Star Belgrade, but this failed to materialize. Busby resumed managerial duties the next season, and eventually built a second generation of Busby Babes, including George Best and Dennis Law, that 10 years later won the European Cup, beating Benfica. Bobby Charlton and Bill Foulkes were the only two crash survivors who lined up in the team. A fund for dependents of victims of the crash was established in March, and chaired by the chairman of the FA, Arthur Drury. The fund had raised £52,000 by the time of its disbursement in October 1958.